Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering the history of Wallsend Hall. I hope you enjoy it. Wallsend Hall does have a lot of history about it, so I will try and get everything in and keep it as short as possible. It is mostly just details of the previous owners and where possible a little bit of information about them too. The hall is too old for me to be able to find details of when it was first built or any of the costs, etc. However, if you look at the actual building, you can see the earlier original parts and also the later extensions, which are more visible from the back and the side views than they are from the front view. Wallsend Hall was seen as one of the most important buildings in Wallsend. It was on the village green, which at the time was all Wallsend consisted of, as the town and the other outlying areas were really all just fields. Most, if not all, of the original owners would have had servants. It was a very big house, so help would have been needed. I did find information about a couple of people who worked there, but sadly the writing on the census was illegible, so I can't really tell you who they were. Around 500 years ago, one of the first known owners of the hall was the Hindmarsh family. Richard Hindmarsh died in 1677 and is buried at Holy Cross. This is the original Holy Cross Chapel, not Holy Cross Cemetery. He is actually buried inside the chapel itself. After Richard died, the hall passed on to his son John, and John died in 1707 at the grand old age of 90. 90 truly was an amazing age in 1707, as most people died in their 40s or 50s back then, and often much younger. John Hindmarsh is also buried within the walls of Holy Cross ruins. I have looked, but sadly there doesn't seem to be much information about the Hindmarsh family. I do have a photo of the grave, which you can see on screen at the moment, but it's almost impossible to read. I think you can see Elizabeth, who is John's sister, and also the 1707, which would be for John. But most is too old and worn to read, so you can't make out if his father and mother are also mentioned. The death of John seems to be the end of the ownership of the Hindmarsh family. Of course, as I said earlier, the 1600s and the 1700s are so long ago that there is very little information available, so it's hard to know if they were the people who originally built the hall or just the first known owners and nothing else. After the Hindmarsh family came the Muncaster family. The hall was said to be their home for more than 3/4 of a century. The family were very wealthy and they owned a lot of land around Wallsend, including the land around the green, the land where the Coach and Horses pub stands, and the land which we now know as Station Road. It was quite common for wealthy Wallsenders to own a lot of land, and I have often wondered how they came to own it, as in who owned it before them, or did they just stake their claim to the areas they liked and that was that. I do not have any information about when the last member of the Muncaster family died or where they are buried, but I did find details of a James Muncaster, described as late of Wallsend, who died in 1797, but I don't know if he was the person who owned the hall or just another member of the family, as he did not die in Wallsend and he's not buried there either. By 1790 the hall was sold to a Mr. William Clark, and he then moved into the hall to make it his home, which would suggest that James Muncaster mentioned before was definitely not living in the home by this time. Mr. Clark was also the first known or the first documented mayor of Wallsend in 1802, and he remained the mayor of Wallsend until around 1804. Unfortunately, I cannot find any details about Mr. Clark, so I do not know if he died in 1804 or if he just moved out. Sadly, there are a lot of past owners who have just become names, as their lives are barely traceable, which is such a shame, as I would love to know more about each one of them. It does seem that Mr. Clark left the hall in around 1804, and the next known owner of the hall was a Mr. Anthony Hood. Mr. Hood is not related to the famous Hood-Haggie family. It's not 100% clear when he actually moved into the hall, but it was known that he was the second recorded mayor of Wallsend from 1808. Not really sure what happened between 1804 and 1808. Perhaps nobody wanted the job, or there was nobody that was seen as being suitable to be mayor. Mr. Hood died in 1812. Some sources actually say it was 1810, and that he was around 51 years old when he died. However, I did find a will for a Mr. Anthony Hood in 1812. It said that he left his estate to his wife Elizabeth. It does seem to be the right man, as he is described as an alderman of the town and also as being from Wallsend at the time of his death. The Hall, however, is not mentioned in the will, and it's incredibly hard to read. It would seem that he had married Elizabeth in 1784 in Newcastle at All Saints, and there was no mention of them having any children, and the Hall certainly didn't pass down to any family members. The next owner of Wallsend Hall was a Mr. John Wright. Mr. Wright was also mayor of Wallsend in 1812. I can't quite work out if you became mayor because you owned the hall or because it was people who desired being mayor who bought the hall, but it certainly seems that if you lived there you ended up being mayor. Mr. Wright was mayor until 1829. In 1835, Mr. Wright presented 2 silver salvers to, as described at the time, the Wallsend Church. This will no doubt have been St. Peter's Church. Mr. Wright died in 1839, and by September of 1839, Wallsend Hall was once again advertised for sale. It was described as a large mansion house situated in the pleasant village of Wallsend with gardens, coach houses, cottages, stables and other convenient buildings, though what the convenient buildings were is not actually explained. The price is not mentioned, as it was nearly always given to interested parties on application to buy, and the next owner was a man by the name of Mr. Edward Grace, who had originally come from Baker. Mr. Grace is described as a land agent in the 1841 census, and there are various newspaper articles about land in the village to let that are taken care of by him. He was married to Sarah, but I have not seen any mention of children, but he did have a brother, or possibly a half-brother, called John, who either worked for him or with him, as John Grace is often mentioned in the land to let articles in the local papers as well. Edward died in around 1853. Again, I have seen a copy of his will, which is almost impossible to read, worse than the previous one, but it seems that he planned to leave everything to his wife and brother. However, it's unclear if they were still alive at the time of his death. The hall was then let rather than sold to a Mr. Carr in 1853. It was listed for sale but also for rent, and as no buyers came forward, it was better to rent than to leave it empty. Mr. Carr remained there until 1856, and it seems that he may have left under a bit of a cloud, as it is said that he sold most of the furniture and all of the wine from the cellar, which he most likely did not have permission to do before he moved out. After he left, once again, the hall was put up for sale or for rent. It was at this point that Mr. Robert Richardson Dees first made his appearance in Wallsend with his decision to buy the hall for his family home. He moved in around December of 1856. I obviously won't go into his life story, as I've already done the history of his life in another video. Robert Richardson Dees died in 1908 at the grand old age of 95. He had lived in the hall with his family from moving in until his death. The hall then passed down to Robert's nephew, Mr. Robert Irwin Dees. He did not live there for very long, and he moved out in 1912. He was married, I believe, to a lady called Elizabeth, and their marriage, for anyone wondering, was at St. Peter's Church, and he appears to have moved to first Yorkshire and then Scotland after leaving the hall. So once again, the hall was put up for sale or for rent. It would seem that people were not so keen by this time to own such big houses, as it did not get much interest from the adverts, and it wasn't until 1914 before it was finally bought by Sir G.B. Hunter of Swan Hunters fame. However, he had no plans to live there. He had a home in Jesmond where he was very happy, so he had no plans to move back to Wallsend, having left there several years earlier. He then kindly gave the Hall, a lot of the land around it, and the Hall grounds to the borough of Wallsend. There was a small section of land said to be close to Crowbank that wasn't part of this gift, but there doesn't seem to be any explanation why. It has to be said that this was a very generous gift, and indeed it was not many people who would have bought a big house and then given it away. But it does seem that this was the kind of man that Mr. Hunter was. I think I would have actually quite liked to have known him. Wallsenders will be all too aware that after this, part of Wallsend Hall was used as a hospital, known officially as the Sir G.B. Hunter Hospital, though mostly just called the Green by locals. I will try and do a history of the hospital another time, as it really is a separate story to that of Wallsend Hall as a home, a house where people lived. The rest of the hall was used for civic ceremonies, which had been part of the wish of G.B. Hunter when he gifted it to the borough. Wallsend Hall is one of the oldest buildings on the Green. Of course, it is no longer used for civic ceremonies and hasn't been used for that purpose for many years, and until recently it had been used as a wedding venue. I went there once for afternoon tea when there used to be a cafe in the hall, and I also had a good look round inside on one of the Heritage Open Days several years ago, although sadly I didn't get to see the cellars, which I now regret, as I would have loved to have seen what they were like. In recent months, extensive research has been done to see what work needs done to bring the hall back to a much better condition than it is at the moment. Although many rumours pass around, there are no plans to demolish the hall. It is hoped it can be repaired and once again let out for public use of some kind, but at the moment it looks a bit sad and unloved as it is boarded up to protect it from damage. Let's hope it's not too long before it's opened back up again and ready to face another 500 or 600 years of interesting life. I hope you have enjoyed this brief history of Wallsend Hall, and I thank you all very much for watching and hope to see you all again very soon.